So I think it is high time for another bad book reading. I've heard a lot of buzz around this book, and it's negative buzz. It's like wasps instead of bumblebees. For multiple reasons, which I will get into later, I kind of debated whether or not I should cover this book at all. I'll go ahead and say that one of them is that I expected a lot of people to make videos about this book. As I was hearing all the buzz, I was waiting for a million videos to roll out of people reading it, reviewing it, whatever. And I waited for that to happen, and it didn't. It seemed like a lot of people didn't go beyond reading the sample pages on Amazon. This isn't a genre that I usually cover, but I too read the sample pages on Amazon, and they were so terrible, and I thought they were so funny that I had to read it. Trigger Warning was written by William W. Johnstone, with J.A. Johnstone credited underneath as a co-author. William Johnstone is a prolific author of, from what I can tell, cowboy books. This is not a cowboy book. Let me read you the summary. From the best-selling authors of The Doomsday Bunker, Black Friday, and Stand Your Ground comes the explosive story of a college under siege and freedom under fire. Political correctness won't save you. That's just all in caps. It's not really part of the summary. It's like, former Army Ranger Jake Rivers is not your typical Kelton College student. He is not spoiled, coddled, or ultra-lib like his classmates who sneer at the Soldier Boy. Do they really call him Soldier Boy? Is it a reference to the rapper? Rivers is not triggered by microaggressions. He is not outraged by male privilege and cisgender bathrooms. He does not need a safe space or coloring books. Jake needs an education. And there is a typo in the summary. Jake's is plural. And when terror strikes, the school needs Jake. Without warning, the sounds of gunfire plunge the campus into a battle zone. A violent gang of marauders invade the main hall, taking students as hostages for big ransom money. As a veteran and patriot, Jake won't give in to their demands. But to fight back, he needs to enlist his fellow classmates to school these special snowflakes in the not-so-liberal art of war. This time, the aggression isn't micro. It's life or death, and only the strong survive. And next to the barcode it says, live free, read hard. I'm cautiously stoked for this one. I was going to get into the backstory of this book's publication, which is a doozy, but I decided it would be funnier if I saved it for the end. So yes, this video has twists. Let's just get right into the book. Oh, and also, gonna add this in before we begin. In case you couldn't tell from the summary, it does involve imagery of gun-wielding bad guys inside of a school setting. So if that is just something you find disturbing, you're probably not going to want to engage with this. So here is your chance to click away before we proceed. A short, sharp cry in the night made Jake Rivers look up from the book he was reading. To be honest, he was glad for the distraction. He was on the verge of throwing the book against the wall of his dorm in disgust, since it was a hard copy, a thick trade paperback he had bought in the university bookstore for an outrageous price, and not something he was reading on his phone or tablet. He could have done that without breaking anything. Already this is a lot. That is probably the nerdiest sentiment I've ever heard expressed in a book. From here on the second floor, he had a good view of Nafziger Plaza, the large park-like area in the center of Kelton College's campus. 3 residence halls, Pierce Saul, Olmsted, and Colohan, running north. Maybe this is naive of me, I thought that first paragraph was going to go into him explaining what was in the book that was frustrating him, but instead now we're just getting like a mental map of the layout of the campus. The administration building was at the northern end, the main science building, Terrell Hall to the south. The big Burr Memorial Library was directly across from where Jake looked out the window. Knowing the premise of this book, I assume this whole layout is going to matter later when he's having to go building to building and save people. So out the window, Jake hears a female call of distress, so he goes outside to investigate. It didn't take him long to get down the stairs. A group of students was sitting in the lobby talking about something. He heard the words microaggression and privilege and cisnormative. Wow, all 3 of those words just in that short time he was passing. That must have been a very concise conversation. Annie, just be reasonable. I'm not going to let go of you until you start thinking straight. Stop, Craig, just stop. The The words gasped out as the woman clearly fought to hold back sobs. "I told you it was over." Jake was still moving toward them, but he stopped as he heard what the woman said. A grimace tugged at his mouth. Lovers quarrel, none of his business. That was an old-fashioned attitude, and he knew it. But almost everything about him was old-fashioned, including his dislike of a woman being mistreated. I guess you could say he shares the sensibilities of a much older man. Of course, if he did step in to help her, more than likely she would stick up for her boyfriend and turn on him instead, accusing him of perpetuating the patriarchy and the myth of women needing to be rescued. But she literally does need to be rescued. Why does he just assume that's what would happen? It's almost as though he's the author of the book and has some incredible foresight as to a frustrating thing that's about to happen. He started to turn away. Then Jake heard the crack of open hand on flesh and stopped in his tracks. He swung around, took several more steps until he could see the two of them fairly well. She was petite and blonde, while the guy was good-sized, with dark hair and a short beard. Wow, it's like I'm there. Something was odd about the shape of his head, and after a second, Jake got it. The guy's hair was long enough that he'd pulled it up into a bun on the top of his head. Full respect that Jake is so slow on the uptake that when he sees a man with a bun, he thinks his head has an odd shape. The guy started tugging on the woman, who was actually crying now. Jake said, "That's enough, Craig. Let her go." "This is none of your business, man." He paused. "Are you one of the football players? You're big enough. But Olmsted's not the athletic dorm." I like that this other man feels the need to comment on the protagonist's bigness. "I'm not a football player, and you need to let go of the lady." "You don't have to call me a lady," Annie said. Just as Jake had expected, she sounded halfway offended. "I'm trying to help you. That's no excuse for perpetuating stereotypes and spreading toxic masculinity." It's amazing how this crazy specific thing that sounds very unlikely that Jake predicted beat for beat played out exactly like that. "I'm not scared of you," Craig shouted. "I don't care how big you are." Why is he calling him big again? "I know Krav Maga." He had just started some sort of fancy martial arts move when Jake hit him with a left hook to the belly. Those fancy karate moves are no match for some old-fashioned gut punching. Craig went down hard, pounding his face against the concrete walk. "You killed him," Annie screeched. She came at him, hissing and spitting. All he'd tried to do was help this woman, and now she wanted to claw his eyes out because he'd hit her boyfriend. "You fascist!" she screamed. "You oppressor!" What is he oppressing? The right of men to hit their girlfriends? Jake heard a sudden rush of footsteps behind him and turned to see several black-clad figures charging him. He couldn't make out their faces, and when they yelled, "Fascist, fascist," and the words were muffled, he knew why. They were wearing hoods over their heads. Wait, why did it say he knew why like he had figured out something clever? He just saw that they were wearing it with his eyeballs. Then they were on him, swinging bicycle chains with locks on them, metal pipes, and other objects turned into clubs. And this peaceful night on the small elite college campus turned into a fight for his life. I love this mystery gang of like ninjas that's popped out of the shadows. Why are they wielding bike chains and like bats and nunchucks? Is this like the Foot Clan? So that's the end of chapter 1, and I have to say, completely sold so far. Jake reached up, closed his right hand around the pipe, and wrenched it free of the attacker's grip. He twirled it, jabbed the end into the kid's stomach, and sent him staggering backward. A second later, somebody landed on Jake's back and wrapped wiry arms and legs around him. "I got him," a female voice yelled. "Kill the fascist! Down with oppressors! Kill him!" What are these characters meant to think was going on? What's the misunderstanding? Jake frowned as he saw that the commotion had attracted several dozen students. His frown deepened as he realized they were cheering on the black-clad attackers. "Wait a minute," he shouted, knowing he was wasting his time but too angry to care. "I didn't do anything wrong. I was just trying to help a woman. Toxic! Toxic! Racist!" The black suits were on their feet again and regrouping. As they got ready to charge him, Jake flashed back for an instant to things he had seen in the past. Men in black hoods spouting Arabic as they held a Western journalist and sawed his head. Oh, okay, it's memories of stuff on the news. More black hooded figures forcing a scared child with a bomb strapped to him down a street while they threatened to kill his mother if he didn't blow up himself and some American soldiers. Are these memories that Jake has? Those same evil men and others just like them shooting at him and his buddies. Okay, so he's flashing back to the war. I don't know if all of those were specifically his own memories or if the first two were just examples of things that reminded him of his real memories. So what appears to have just happened is that Jake had a horrible flashback to some very violent and disturbing memories, which caused him lingering trauma from his time in the war because of a thing that was happening currently, which reminded him too strongly of it. And I feel like there's a word for that. Drop 'em! Drop those weapons! The shouted command came from behind him. He turned, saw the half-dozen uniformed campus cops converging on him. Phelps, deploy taser! He heard a stun gun fire, felt the fierce jab as the first set of needles pierced his shirt and lanced into his flesh to deliver their jolt of electricity. Good writing. He staggered as the shock coursed through him, but he didn't go down. I guess he's just too big. Dang it, Jake, what am I gonna do with you? Frank McRaney leaned back in the chair behind his desk, sighed, and shook his head. He was the chief of the campus police, and clearly he didn't appreciate being called to his office late in the evening like this when he should have been home with his family. So McRaney is like a good old-fashioned guy. He wants to just let Jake off the hook. He's just kind of giving him a stern talking to. He understands it wasn't his fault. Most people here at Kelton didn't know who his grandfather was, but McRaney was a family friend and had known Cordell Gardner as a young man. Not super fair that he's off the hook because the guy knew his grandpa. I thought it's just because he believed in his innocence, but I was wrong. Why are you here, Jake? Is it just because of your grandfather? This is the question I have been wondering. Jake hesitated. So now Jake just starts telling us, the reader, that he has a bad relationship with his father and they don't talk anymore, and doesn't answer the question. Jake, McRaney prodded, but Jake was lost in the past. Which is the author's way of telling us that we are about to enter an extended flashback sequence 6 months earlier. Pull! Cordell Gardner tracked the clay pigeon with the shotgun, leading it perfectly as he squeezed the trigger. The pigeon exploded into small fragments as the buckshot hit it. Alright, so now we're in a conversation about him going to college with his grandfather, Cordell Gardner, who is basically Jake's father figure. He and his grandfather were standing at the edge of a large field that Cordell Gardner used for skeet shooting. The roof of the old man's house, which was big but somehow not ostentatious, was visible over the trees behind them. Gardner's estate sprawled over a lot of East Texas acres and included tennis courts, stables, and a 9-hole golf course, even though Gardner didn't play tennis, ride horses, or have any use for golf. Sometimes his guests did, though, and he'd been raised to be hospitable. It's important that we know that Cordell is rich enough to have all these things, but too masculine to engage with any of them. He was a big old man, although not as big as Jake's 6'4" and 250 pounds. I'm so glad we get a running update on the relative bigness of these characters. The shock of hair on his head was snow white, which made the deep, permanent tan on his weathered face seem even darker than it really was. He had an air of vitality about him despite his age, and seemed to be nowhere near dying. This is a very complimentary description of an old man. Okay, so the conversation was really long, but basically the point is that Jake's grandfather encouraged him to go to college after he got back from serving in the military, and his grandpa's like, you're gonna have a great time, you won't regret it. But Jake had regretted it, almost immediately. His grandfather had said he would fit right in. Nothing could have been further from the truth. Just looking at some of the names of the courses listed in the catalog had him frowning and figuratively scratching his head. If scratching his head is an expression, you don't have to tell me that it's figurative. Gender, culture, and U.S. national identity. Feminist critique of Christianity, social justice and American racism, the psychological impact of male microaggression, countering warmongering and oppression in American culture. Jake had never seen such a load of useless baloney in all his life. Where were the regular courses? I'd imagine that they're on a different page, Jake. Are you in like the gender studies section? I'm just gonna go out on a limb and assume these are not gen ed courses. Jake closed the catalog. He was grateful that he wouldn't have to mess with any of that sort of course, since he was going for his master's degree in biology. Okay. He found out different when he met with his faculty advisor. Kelton College requires a diverse course load, even for specialized advanced degrees, the professor said. A brass nameplate on his desk read Dr. Mutombo. The guy was as pale as anybody Jake had ever seen. Tall, balding, gawky, with a receding chin. He looked like a big white bird. I feel very attacked by this description. Jake couldn't help himself. He said, Dr. Mutombo? The man sniffed. I identify as African American. My ancestors were colonialists named Montombo, who lived for a time in French Equatorial Africa before immigrating to this country. I simply adopted a more appropriate spelling to honor the unfortunate people they oppressed and exploited. How does that track? Okay, so two things. First, why did Jake not look up the requirements for every student before deciding to go to this college? And second, I would like to point out that this scene is a good illustration of my general beef with this book not having people behave like people. So if we can rewind for a second to the beginning of this scene, Jake walked into this professor's office in office hours and said, Dr. Mutombo? And for some reason the professor responded by being like, yes, my name is Dr. Mutombo, and here's why. Let me tell you this extended personal backstory. And in fact, for any normal human being, if someone walks into your office during office hours and says your name in a questioning tone, like Dr. Mutombo, you would then go, yes. Oh, please have a seat. You're just in time for office hours. You wouldn't assume that they were asking you why your name is your name. Oh, also, Jake tells us that Mutombo has skinny fingers, so we can assume that he is not big at all. Okay, the beginning of this chapter has just reminded me that all of that was part of a long flashback, and he is still in McRaney's office, failing to answer the question. Sorry, sir, Jake said. I guess I got a little distracted there. So basically, to answer the question, Jake just reiterates everything we saw in the flashback with his grandfather to Chief McRaney. Then Chief McRaney commiserates about how he also hates all the students here, and he tells Jake that he can go. The night was still warm and pleasant as Jake walked along concrete paths, under trees, past stately old brick buildings. When he was in a particularly dark, shadow-filled stretch of sidewalk, two shapes stepped out in front of him and brought him to an abrupt stop. Some faint sounds from behind told him the jaws of the trap had just closed on that side as well. Hello, fellas, Jake said. Are you the campus patrol, come to see that I get back to my dorm safely? Jake is not only big, but sassy. A muffled voice, disguised even more by whispering, said, Shut up! Which is not very intimidating. That's right, folks. The masked goons are back. There's another fight. There is a lot of throat punching. The only difference this time being that Jake is trying to be quiet so he doesn't alert the campus police, who he believes will blame him again. And I guess, given the way this universe has worked so far, he's probably right on that count. So Jake wins. Jake walked off and left the man there sobbing. He took deep breaths as he walked along the sidewalk in front of the library. He worked his shoulders, sore but good to go. The damage he had taken in the fight was minimal, he decided. That thought was running through his mind when someone stepped out from behind one of the columns on the library porch and said, I saw what you did back there. She just stood there with her hands in the hip pockets of the jeans she wore and looked at him. It was a casual stance, but it might have been calculated to make her breasts stand out a little more prominently against the shirt she wore. If that was the case, it worked. The hair that tumbled around her shoulders shone reddish gold in the light. Jake couldn't see her eyes, but he was willing to bet they were brown. A deep, rich brown. What does that mean? Why is he willing to bet that? Are you going to take out your phone and call the cops? He asked. Would you try to stop me if I did? She asked. He shook his head. For a long moment she regarded him in silence, standing at the edge of the porch with 6 broad steps between her and Jake on the sidewalk. Then she said, I'm not going to call the campus police. I'm Jake Rivers, by the way. I know who you are. You're not exactly a run-of-the-mill Kelton College student. There are rumors among the faculty that you must be related to some big donor, but nobody seems to know exactly who it is. Or if they do, they're keeping it to themselves. You're a professor? Criminal justice. Dr. Natalie Burke. So since we heard about her breasts, I assume that was flirting. They'd talk of it more and then part ways, and then we jump to the next morning when the president of the college is asked to see Jake. As he walked toward the administration building the next morning, he noticed when someone stepped up beside him, hurrying to keep up with his long-legged strides. His legs are as big as the rest of him. You look different this morning, Dr. Natalie Burke said. Am I allowed to say you look nice? Jake asked. Or is that a microaggression? Coming from someone as big as you, I'm not sure a microaggression is possible. Jake... This is my favorite running bit, and it does not disappoint. The trigger warning drinking game is every time Jake is big.